Hey, Reddit. I've been sitting on this for a while, and honestly, I don't even know if sharing it here will help, but I need to get it out. So here goes nothing. For context, I'm a 34-year-old Army veteran, just back from an 18-month deployment overseas. It was one of the hardest periods of my life, both physically and emotionally. But through all the grueling days and sleepless nights, what kept me going was the thought of my wife, Jessica, waiting for me back home. We've been married for 6 years. I'm not going to sit here and claim everything was perfect, it wasn't. No marriage is. But we had a good thing, or at least, I thought we did. Jessica and I met at a friend's barbecue 8 years ago, and from the moment I saw her, I was hooked. She's charming, beautiful, and has this magnetic energy that just draws people to her. When we got married, I genuinely believed we'd be one of those couples who'd stick it out, no matter what. Before I left for deployment, things were good between us. Or at least good enough. There were minor issues, like me being too focused on work or her complaining about how I didn't help enough around the house, but nothing that seemed insurmountable. We talked about the challenges of a long deployment and how we'd handle the distance. She promised me we'd stay strong, that she'd be here for me when I came home. At first, she kept that promise. She sent care packages, sweet messages, and the occasional photo to remind me of what I had waiting for me. But as the months dragged on, something started to shift. Our phone calls became less frequent. When I'd call, it was always the same excuses. Sorry, work has been crazy. My phone died earlier, and I forgot to charge it. I'm just so busy with everything right now. Can we talk tomorrow? She wasn't cold exactly, but there was this distance I couldn't explain. I'd be pouring my heart out about how much I missed her, how hard it was to be away, and she'd respond with this detached, almost distracted tone. Like she wasn't really listening. Still, I told myself not to overthink it. I was halfway across the world, under immense stress, and I didn't want to be the guy who got paranoid just because his wife wasn't picking up the phone as often as he'd like. Besides, Jessica was always independent, always had her own life outside of me. That's one of the things I loved about her. So, I let it go. But then, about halfway through my deployment, I started noticing little things that didn't sit right. For one, her social media went from being full of pictures of us, vacations, anniversaries, goofy selfies, to almost nothing about me. Instead, it was all work events, gym sessions, and photos with her friends. I tried not to read too much into it. I mean, it's not like I was expecting her to post, "I miss my husband," every other day. But something about the way she was curating her life online felt off. Like I wasn't part of the picture anymore. There were other things too. Whenever I'd mention coming home early, which I never ended up doing, her reaction wasn't what I expected. She didn't sound excited, she sounded apprehensive. Like the idea of me showing up without notice made her nervous. One time, I joked about surprising her and she laughed it off, saying, "Mark, you know how much I hate surprises. Just stick to the plan, okay?" At the time, I chalked it up to her being her usual control freak self. But now, looking back, I can't help but wonder if there was something more to it. By the time my deployment was wrapping up, I couldn't wait to get home. Despite the nagging doubts in the back of my mind, I told myself Jessica was just dealing with stress in her own way. She had a demanding job in real estate, after all, and with me gone, I figured she was juggling more than her fair share of responsibilities. I wanted to believe that once I walked through that door, everything would fall back into place. That we'd pick up right where we left off, stronger for having made it through the distance. I was wrong. And honestly, if I had known what I was walking into, I don't know if I ever would have come back. After what felt like a lifetime away, my deployment finally ended. The journey home was surreal, every mile bringing me closer to the life I'd left behind. I'd thought about Jessica constantly during those 18 months, imagining her face lighting up when she saw me again, how she'd throw her arms around me like in one of those airport reunion videos. I decided to surprise her. It wasn't easy keeping my return under wraps, but I thought it would be worth it. The plan was simple: walk through that front door, flowers in hand, and sweep her off her feet. A grand romantic gesture to show her how much I missed her and how happy I was to be home. But as I pulled into our driveway, something didn't feel right. Jessica's car was parked outside, so I knew she was home. But there were other details that threw me off. For starters, the lights were off in most of the house, even though it wasn't late. Jessica hated sitting in the dark. She was one of those people who turned on every lamp the moment she walked into a room. I grabbed my bag, took a deep breath, and walked up to the front door. I pushed it open, expecting the warm, familiar smell of our home, Jessica's favorite vanilla candles, or maybe the faint aroma of dinner. Instead, I was hit with something entirely different: cologne. Not mine. I stood there for a moment, my brain struggling to process the details that didn't add up. A pair of sneakers sat by the door, men's sneakers, big ones. A half-empty bottle of wine was on the kitchen counter, along with 2 glasses. That's when I noticed the sounds. Laughter, muffled voices, and movement. They were coming from upstairs. My heart started pounding, a mix of confusion and dread swirling in my chest. Maybe she had friends over. But even as I tried to convince myself, I couldn't shake the sinking feeling that something was seriously wrong. Quietly, I set my bag down and started up the stairs. Each step felt heavier than the last. The closer I got, the clearer the voices became. One was definitely Jessica's, high-pitched and giggling in a way I hadn't heard in years. The others were male. 2 distinct male voices. By the time I reached the bedroom door, my legs felt like they were made of lead. The door was cracked open just enough for me to see inside. What I saw stopped me cold. Jessica was on our bed. With 2 men. It was like a scene out of some terrible, twisted nightmare. She was in the middle, laughing and touching both of them in ways that left no room for doubt about what was happening. One of the men, a younger guy with messy blonde hair, leaned over to kiss her while the other, older and broader, was pulling off his shirt. For a moment, I couldn't move. My body refused to react, as if my brain needed more time to catch up with what my eyes were seeing. Then, without thinking, I pushed the door open. The sound startled all 3 of them. Jessica yelped and scrambled to cover herself with the sheets, her face pale and frozen in shock. The blonde guy, Derek, I'd later learn, grabbed his pants off the floor and started fumbling to put them on. The older one, Mike, just stood there shirtless, staring at me like a deer in headlights. The room was silent except for the sound of my breathing. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. I just stood there, taking it all in. The tangled sheets, the discarded clothes on the floor, the smell of sweat and cologne mixing with Jessica's perfume. Mark, Jessica's voice broke the silence. She sounded breathless, panicked. I didn't expect you home yet. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. That was what she led with. Not an apology, not an explanation, just the fact that I'd surprised her. Derek muttered something under his breath, some half-hearted excuse about how he didn't know she was married. Mike, still frozen, finally moved to grab his shirt and mumbled, "This is, not what it looks like." I snapped out of my daze at that. Not what it looks like. My voice was calm, eerily calm. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're both screwing my wife in my bed. Neither of them had a response for that. They just stood there awkwardly, waiting for Jessica to say something. "Mark, I can explain," Jessica stammered, clutching the sheet around her. Her voice was shaky, her eyes wide with fear. This wasn't supposed to happen. I laughed bitterly. Really? Which part? The part where you invite 2 men into my house, or the part where I come home early and catch you in the act? Derek finished putting on his pants and grabbed his shoes, clearly eager to get out of there. Look, man, I'm sorry. I didn't know. Save it, I cut him off, my voice sharp enough to make him flinch. Just get out. He didn't need to be told twice. Mike followed, mumbling another useless apology as he shuffled past me, avoiding eye contact. That left just me and Jessica. She was still sitting on the bed, clutching the sheet like it was the only thing tethering her to reality. Mark, please, she started again, her voice trembling. I can explain everything. It's not what you think. I stared at her, the weight of her betrayal hitting me all at once. It's exactly what I think, I said quietly. You had 2 men in our bed, Jessica. 2. Tears welled up in her eyes, but they didn't move me. I'd seen enough to know they weren't tears of regret, they were tears of someone who had been caught. I turned and walked out of the room. I couldn't look at her anymore. The woman I thought I knew, the woman I'd been fighting for, wasn't real. Jessica lingered in the doorway, her disheveled hair and wide eyes betraying her attempt to compose herself. Her lips trembled as if she were searching for the right words, but what came out made my blood boil. You weren't supposed to be home yet. You should have told me you were coming. I stared at her, stunned. That was what she had to say. Not an apology, not an ounce of remorse, just the audacity to blame me for showing up unannounced. That's what you have to say? I asked, my voice low and simmering with rage. That I caught you off guard? What about what you're doing right now? What about them? Jessica crossed her arms defensively, the sheet she'd grabbed from the bed still draped around her like some warped attempt at modesty. Mark, it's not what you think. Derek and Mike are just friends. It's not serious. Friends? I cut her off, my voice rising. Friends don't strip down and climb into bed with my wife. She flinched but quickly recovered, her tone shifting from defensive to dismissive. You're overreacting. It's not like I planned this. It just happened. Just happened. I repeated, my voice dripping with disbelief. You expect me to believe that? That you accidentally invited 2 men into our house, into our bed, and things just got out of hand? Jessica opened her mouth to respond, but before she could say anything, Derek and Mike emerged from the bedroom, fully dressed and looking like 2 kids caught sneaking out past curfew. Look, man, Derek stammered, avoiding my eyes. We're sorry. We didn't know. Save it, I snapped, my eyes darting between them. Just get out. Both of you. Mike mumbled something that sounded like an apology, but I didn't care enough to ask him to repeat it. They shuffled past me, their heads down, and practically tripped over each other trying to reach the front door. The sound of it closing behind them was a small relief, but it did nothing to quiet the storm raging inside me. I turned back to Jessica, who was now pacing the living room, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She looked at me with a mixture of defiance and desperation. Mark, you don't understand. Then make me understand. I shouted, my voice finally cracking under the weight of everything I was feeling. Explain to me how you thought this was okay. How you thought you could betray me like this after everything I've done for us. Jessica stopped pacing and turned to face me, her eyes narrowing. Oh, don't you dare turn this into a sob story about everything you've done for us. You're not a saint, Mark. You've been gone for almost 2 years. Do you have any idea how lonely it's been? How hard it is to keep everything together while you're off playing soldier? Her words hit me like a slap. Playing soldier. I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. Jessica, I was fighting to protect our future, sacrificing time with you so that we could have a better life. Do you think I enjoyed being away? Missing birthdays, anniversaries. You think that's enough? She interrupted, her voice rising. You think paying the bills and sending a few texts from overseas makes you a good husband? You weren't here, Mark. I had to deal with everything on my own, and you didn't even notice when I needed more from you. I took a step back, struggling to process what she was saying. So this is my fault. You're blaming me for your choice to cheat. Jessica threw up her hands, the sheet slipping slightly from her shoulders. I'm not saying it was the right thing to do, okay? But you weren't exactly making it easy for me. You were always so controlling, even when you weren't here. Always checking in, asking where I was, who I was with. That's called communication, I shot back. Or do you think it's unreasonable for me to want to know what's going on in my own marriage? You were suffocating me, Mark, she shouted, her voice breaking. Even from halfway across the world, you made everything about you, your job, your sacrifices. What about me? What about what I needed? Her words were like knives, each one cutting deeper than the last. For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. My anger, my heartbreak, it all felt too big to put into words. Finally, I said, "You're unbelievable. Do you even hear yourself right now? You're standing here, trying to justify the fact that you slept with 2 men in our bed, and you're making me the villain." Jessica's face crumpled, and for a second, I thought I saw genuine regret. But then her expression hardened again, and I knew she wasn't going to back down. "I didn't plan for this to happen, Mark," she said, her voice quieter but no less defensive. "But I'm not going to stand here and pretend everything was perfect before you left. You checked out of this marriage long before I did." I stared at her, the weight of her words pressing down on me like a ton of bricks. For 6 years, I had trusted her. Loved her. Fought for her. And now, here she was, tearing all of that apart with a casual cruelty I never thought she was capable of. "I can't do this," I muttered, shaking my head. "I can't listen to you twist this around anymore. You made your choices, Jessica. And now you're going to have to live with them." She took a step toward me, her eyes pleading. "Mark, please. Don't throw everything away because of one mistake. We can fix this. We can go to therapy." I cut her off, my voice cold and steady. "This isn't one mistake, Jessica. This is a pattern. This is who you are. And I can't be a part of it anymore." I turned and walked toward the door, grabbing my keys off the table. Jessica called after me, her voice cracking with desperation, but I didn't look back. I needed air. I needed to get out of that house before I said or did something I couldn't take back. Because as much as I wanted to hurt her the way she'd hurt me, I knew that nothing I said could make her understand the depth of her betrayal. The woman I thought I knew was gone. And so was I. When I finally left the house that night, I didn't have a destination in mind. I just drove, letting the hum of the engine and the emptiness of the dark roads drown out the chaos in my head. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached, but I didn't care. I needed to keep moving, to escape the image of Jessica in that bed with those 2 men. After an hour of aimless driving, I pulled into an empty parking lot. The anger hit me like a tidal wave. My breathing quickened, and I slammed my fists against the steering wheel repeatedly until my hands throbbed. But no matter how hard I hit, it didn't dull the pain inside. Eventually, I went home. The house felt different, like a stranger's place instead of the home I'd fought to protect. Everywhere I looked, there were reminders of her, the photos on the walls, her favorite blanket draped over the couch, the mug she always used for her morning coffee. It was like the ghost of our life together was mocking me. The anger came in waves that night. One moment, I'd be pacing the living room, fists clenched and jaw tight, thinking about everything I should have said to her. The next, I'd collapse onto the couch, overwhelmed by the crushing sadness of it all. I thought about the promises we made to each other on our wedding day, the plans we had for the future, and how easily she'd thrown it all away. At some point, I punched a hole in the wall near the staircase. The drywall crumbled beneath my fist, but the pain felt good. It was real, tangible, a distraction from the ache in my chest. The next morning, I called Connor, my best friend since high school. He could tell something was wrong the moment I said his name. "Mark?" he asked, his voice cautious. "You okay?" "No," I admitted, my voice cracking. "I need you to come over." He didn't ask questions. Within half an hour, he was at my door. When I let him in, Connor took one look at me and knew something serious had happened. I hadn't slept, my knuckles were raw and bruised, and I couldn't even bring myself to meet his eyes. "Talk to me," he said, guiding me to the couch. "What's going on?" As soon as I started talking, it all came pouring out. I told him everything, how I'd come home early to surprise Jessica, the men in our bed, the excuses she tried to give me, and how broken I felt in the aftermath. By the time I finished, my throat was tight and I could barely breathe. Connor sat in stunned silence for a moment, processing everything I'd said. Then he shook his head, his expression hardening. "You don't deserve this, man," he said firmly. "You've given her everything, your time, your loyalty, your trust, and this is how she repays you. She's not worth it, Mark. You're better than this." His words were a lifeline, pulling me out of the swirling sea of shame I'd been drowning in. But even as I nodded, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered doubts. "What if I'm not?" I asked quietly. "What if this is my fault? What if I wasn't enough for her?" Connor's expression darkened. "Stop that," he said, his tone sharp. "Don't you dare put this on yourself. This isn't about you not being enough. This is about her being selfish and deceitful. You've been out there fighting for your country, for her, and she couldn't even keep her vows. That's on her, not you." His words made sense, but it was hard to internalize them. I couldn't stop replaying every moment of our marriage, looking for the cracks I'd missed. Had I worked too much? Was I not affectionate enough? Should I have pushed harder to communicate, even from thousands of miles away? Connor seemed to sense what I was thinking, because he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Mark, listen to me. You can't blame yourself for someone else's choices. You did your best. You were faithful, you trusted her, and you gave her the life she said she wanted. If that wasn't enough for her, that's not a reflection on you. That's on her." I nodded slowly, though the weight of those doubts didn't lift immediately. The next few days were a blur of emotions. The anger lingered, but it was joined by a deep sadness that seemed to settle in my bones. I couldn't stop thinking about the life I thought I had, the woman I thought I knew. I stayed in touch with Connor, who checked in on me constantly. He was the one who encouraged me to stop spiraling and start taking steps to protect myself. "First things first," he said one afternoon when he came by with coffee and a bag of fast food. "You need to get your head straight. Talk to a lawyer, figure out your options, and start making a plan. You can't let her keep the upper hand." I wasn't ready to think about divorce yet, but his advice gave me something to focus on, a way to channel my anger into something productive. Little by little, I started to reclaim my sense of self. I realized that Jessica's betrayal wasn't about me or what I lacked. It was about her character, her inability to face the challenges of our marriage with integrity. I thought about all the times I'd trusted her implicitly, the sacrifices I'd made to build a life for us, and the way she'd taken it all for granted. It hurt, but it also gave me clarity. This wasn't my failure. It was hers. By the end of the week, I felt a newfound resolve. I wasn't going to let her actions define me or destroy me. I had fought through worse battles in my life, and I wasn't about to let Jessica's betrayal be the thing that broke me. Connor was right, I deserved better. And for the first time since that night, I started to believe it. After days of replaying everything in my mind, I made the hardest decision of my life. My marriage to Jessica was over. It wasn't just the betrayal that sealed it, it was her complete lack of remorse. The way she twisted everything, deflected blame, and tried to gaslight me into believing her infidelity was somehow my fault. I couldn't stay married to someone who could so casually destroy the life we'd built together and then act like I was the problem. The morning after I decided to leave, I called a divorce lawyer. His name was Jeff, recommended by Connor, and he didn't sugarcoat anything. "Mark," Jeff said, his voice calm and measured, "this isn't going to be easy. Divorces rarely are. But the good news is, Virginia doesn't look kindly on adultery. If you've got evidence, we can protect your interests and make sure you come out of this as clean as possible." Evidence. The word hit me like a lightning bolt. I hadn't thought much about gathering proof, but now that Jeff had mentioned it, I realized it was the only way to ensure Jessica wouldn't twist the narrative. She was manipulative, and I couldn't risk her trying to paint me as the villain. That evening, while Jessica was at work, I started combing through her laptop. She wasn't the most tech-savvy person, and her passwords were predictable. It didn't take long to get in. What I found confirmed everything I already knew and then some. There were texts between her and Derek, full of flirtation and explicit promises of their next, intimate, rendezvous. In one thread, Derek mentioned how much he loved the thrill of being with her while I was away. Jessica's reply was seared into my mind, "He's so oblivious. He'll never know." I also found messages between her and Mike, filled with the same gross arrogance. One particularly painful exchange had Jessica complaining about how boring our marriage had become and how Mike made her feel alive again. I took screenshots of everything and emailed them to myself. I even saved a few photos they'd exchanged, though it made me sick to look at them. The next step was harder. During one of our arguments later that week, I pressed Jessica again for answers. I didn't expect her to admit to anything, but I set my phone on the counter, recording the conversation just in case. "Why them?" I asked, my voice raw. "Wasn't one enough? You had to bring two different men into our house." She rolled her eyes, a gesture that sent my blood boiling. "Mark, it's not like I planned for it to happen. They were just there. It was fun, okay? Something different. You don't have to make it a big deal." "A big deal?" I repeated, incredulous. "You're calling two affairs fun and something different? Do you even hear yourself?" "I didn't mean it like that," she snapped, folding her arms. "I didn't think it would hurt you this much." That line confirmed everything I needed to know about Jessica's complete disregard for me and our marriage. When the argument ended, I saved the recording and sent it to my lawyer along with the screenshots. Jeff promised to file the divorce papers by the end of the week. While I waited for everything to be finalized, I enlisted Connor to help me pack up my things. I couldn't bear to stay in that house any longer. Every corner of it reminded me of what I'd lost, and Jessica's presence only made it worse. We spent an entire Saturday boxing up my life. Clothes, personal items, photos I couldn't bring myself to look at. Connor cracked jokes to lighten the mood, but I could see the anger simmering beneath his usual humor. "You're doing the right thing," he said as he taped up a box. "She doesn't deserve you, and she doesn't deserve this life you built for her." When Jessica came home that evening to find me moving out, she panicked. "Mark, wait," she cried, dropping her bag on the floor. "What are you doing? Where are you going?" "I'm done," I said simply, not stopping. "The papers are being filed. This is over." Her eyes widened, and for a moment, I thought she might cry. But instead of tears, she unleashed a torrent of anger. "You can't just leave," she shouted, her voice shaking. "We've been together for 6 years. You're really going to throw that away because of one mistake?" "This wasn't one mistake, Jessica," I replied, my voice calm but firm. "It was a series of choices. Choices you made over and over again, knowing full well what it would do to me." She switched tactics, her tone softening as she stepped closer. "Mark, please. It didn't mean anything. I still love you. We can fix this if you'll just give me a chance." Her words might have worked a week ago, but now I saw them for what they were, empty. "I gave you chances, Jessica," I said. "I gave you trust. I gave you everything. And you threw it away. This is who you are. And I'm done trying to fix it. The next morning, she was served with the divorce papers. I wasn't there when it happened, but Connor was. He later told me she looked shocked at first, then furious. She called me every name in the book: selfish, heartless, a coward. She even threatened to ruin me, though I'm not sure how she thought she could. But the difference now was that I didn't care. Her words didn't sting anymore. Her manipulations didn't work. I was finally free of her toxicity. As I write this, the divorce isn't finalized yet, but I'm at peace with my decision. Leaving Jessica was the hardest thing I've ever done, but it was also the most necessary. I realized that staying with her wouldn't save our marriage, it would only destroy me. To anyone out there dealing with betrayal, my advice is this: trust your instincts, protect yourself, and don't let someone else's actions define your worth. You deserve better, even if it's hard to see that right now. As for me, I'm taking it one day at a time. I've reconnected with old friends, started focusing on my own mental health, and even signed up for a therapy group for veterans. It's not easy, but for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm moving forward. Here's to better days ahead.